We're back for your ears only. I'm Melissa Axelberth.
I'm David Alpern with this quote from the news. They don't trust me and I don't trust them. That was Afghan President Hamid Karzai submitting to local leaders assembled in Aloya, Jirga, a proposed security arrangement with Washington that would keep thousands of U.S. soldiers and allied forces there through 2014. But Karzai said it would not be signed until after next year's election, raising doubts about how or whether the plan would go forward. Now this.
The energy, the faith, the devotion which we bring to this endeavor will light our country and all who serve it. And the glow from that fire can truly light the world.
7 years ago,
our fathers brought forth on this continent
a new nation, conceived in liberty,
and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, and that government of the people,
by the people, for the people,
shall not perish from the earth.
As a young journalist at the world headquarters of United Press International, I watched the newswire 50 years ago as bureaus around the country kept trying to slip in their top stories between paragraphs of the initial JFK assassination report and kept getting overwhelmed by it. The memory came back to me last week for many obvious reasons, but especially on the day when, for good reason, Kennedy's most famous words kept sharing TV time with those of another assassinated president, Abraham Lincoln, at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, 150 years ago, and even more important to the development of democracy in this nation and around the world.
Tennessee General Sessions Judge James L. Cotton Jr. calls his new book about those words quite simply the greatest speech ever, the remarkable story of Abraham Lincoln and his Gettysburg Address, from the History Publishing Company, with a foreword by former Tennessee Senator Howard Baker Jr. And to explore some myths and realities about that remarkably brief oration, only 286 words, for your ears only, Judge Cotton joins us now. Welcome to the program.
Oh, it's good to be here.
You write of a lifelong interest in the Gettysburg Address, though the book was inspired by the multiple terrorist assassinations of 9/11-2001. Tell us first how that earlier interest came to be.
Like many students of my generation in the late 50s, it was routine to memorize the Gettysburg Address and recite it at school, much like the Pledge of Allegiance. And as a boy, I began to love those words, and we had a Gettysburg speech contest. I practiced and entered it, and of course I tell my friends I folded up like a lawn chair, left a couple of lines out, butchered up some others, but there was something about the beauty and the cadence and the rhythm of those words that captured me.
And how did 9/11 trigger you to research and write a book about the speech?
It was sort of an epiphany moment for me as a Lincoln fan. I had came home from a court case, and I was walking through the living room, and they were having the ceremonies for the one-year anniversary of the September 11th attack on America. And I heard the words of the Gettysburg Address begin, and at that moment I realized that those words were not about September 19th, 1863. They were about today and about the future of America, and I decided I wanted to know more about them and write about them.
As with Kennedy 100 years later in Texas, there were fears for Lincoln's safety when he traveled to Gettysburg, actually going through a city where an earlier plot on his life had been foiled. Remind us about that and the anger over his position on slavery and the terrible Civil War.
At Lincoln's inauguration, he was a little naive about the condition of the country. He terribly underestimated the fervor of the Southern sentiments to succeed from the Union. But he drove down Pennsylvania Avenue for his inauguration in an open carriage just like Kennedy. And they had federal sharpshooters on every building. But really that moment leading to his inauguration was the first time that the possibility of the assassination of a president came into the American psyche.
Let's turn to the mystery and myth about the Gettysburg Address itself, exactly when and how it was written. Absolutely not on the back of an envelope as he rode to deliver it, you note. Where did that myth originate and why has it persisted?
Well, there was a beautiful little book written in the early 1900s by Mary Andrews. It was called The Perfect Tribute. It was read to me in the third grade by our teacher. and it told the beautiful story of him picking up a piece of wrapping paper off of the train on the way to Gettysburg, and taking a little stubby pencil and scribbling out the Gettysburg Address in a moment of inspiration. It didn't happen that way. It's been in movies. Even Lincoln's oldest son, Robert, who lived to be 83 years old, thought for many years that his father wrote the speech on a train. The truth is that Lincoln wrote about one half of the speech in the 2 weeks before he left for Gettysburg. And then when he arrived in Gettysburg that night, staying at the home of an attorney named David Wills, he finished his speech, probably got up early the next morning after visiting the battlefields and put a few more brushstrokes on it. But he was under quite a bit of pressure when he went to Gettysburg. Not only was his son terribly sick, he didn't like leaving Washington during the war, but when he got on that train to Gettysburg, he only had one half of his speech completed.
No one can mistake the powerful political poetry of Lincoln's prose and its universal appeal. But you also note the importance of some potentially divisive words he left out.
That is probably one of the exceptional aspects of the Gettysburg Address. Lincoln had the thought to rise above the passions of the war, to look to the long view. Of course, it was a war speech, and his primary goal was to help the country understand why this terrible, bloody war had to go on. You know, there was terrible war fatigue in the country. You could relate it much to how people felt about Vietnam towards the end of the war. But he was also trying to bind the country together. He was explaining why the Union, the United States of America, had to be saved. And not only that, why slavery had to be abolished. And that goal of saving the country and the destruction of slavery had to be one goal, one purpose. Lincoln was telling people they could not be one without the other. So he spoke not to Northerners, not to Southerners. He didn't use terms like North and South or slavery. He spoke to all Americans, and in that way, he really speaks to us today.
There was controversy last week because the portion of the address read by President Obama for a Ken Burns TV project that we excerpted to introduce this segment did not include the words "under God." How do those words figure in Lincoln's actual delivery and the various copies he handwrote later?
Those words, when Lincoln spoke, were extemporaneous, and that's the amazing part of this. Gettysburg was a mountaintop experience for Lincoln. Mary Lincoln, First Lady, said that he became religious more than ever after Gettysburg. So he didn't have those words written in his notes. When he looked out over those gravesites and those injured soldiers and the crowd, those words came from the heart.
Tennessee General Sessions Judge James L. Cotton, Jr. His new book is The Greatest Speech Ever, The Remarkable Story of Abraham Lincoln and His Gettysburg Address, from the History Publishing Company.
Quote from the news, the Scottsboro boys have received justice. That was Alabama Governor Robert J. Bentley on the decision by state officials to grant posthumous pardons for 3 of the black men convicted 80 years ago in the infamous case of a white woman who subsequently recanted her accusation of rape. In the group of 9, 5 others previously had charges against them dropped 4 years after the incident.
Next, Surviving Ourselves, the Climate Population Equation, for your ears only.